Hello, and welcome to this Quincy Institute book talk on the non-aligned world. My name is Sarang Shidore, and I'm the director of the Global South program here at the Quincy Institute. We are a transpartisan foreign policy think tank in Washington, D.C., promoting ideas to move the United States away from military interventionism and toward more diplomacy and economic engagement in the spirit of realist restraint. The Global South program at the Quincy Institute aims to achieve a new bargain between the United States and this meta region stretching from Mexico City to Manila. The program recognizes the Global South's instinct for multi alignment and aims to build mutually productive relations in the national interest. As the rivalry between the US, China, and Russia continues, many states in Latin America, Asia, and Africa seek to work with all great powers. They do so to gain the most benefits from the global order and form coalitions to solve regional and global challenges. A great new book titled The Non Aligned World Striking Out in the Era of Great Power Competition, authored by Jorge Heine, Carlos Fortin, and Carlos Ominami, explains the concept of what the authors call active non alignment, its relevance in today's world, and its implications for Latin America and indeed the whole world. To tell us about the book, we have Ambassador Jorge Heine himself here from Santiago, Chile. Jorge, welcome to the Quincy Institute and our conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. A real privilege.
Wonderful. Well, let me first tell viewers about you, a little more about you. There's lots there, so I have condensed it to what can fit our show. You're now, of course, newly joined as a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, so welcome on that as well. But from 2019 to 2025, you were research professor at the Frederick Espade School of Global Studies at Boston University. From 2018 to 2019, you were public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And before that, you had a long stint in the Chilean government as cabinet minister, ambassador to China, to India, to South Africa. And then you were also past vice president of the International Political Science Association, CIGI professor of global governance at Wilfrid Laurier University. And last but not the least, you also held visiting appointments at the universities of Constance, Oxford, Paris, and Tsinghua, and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Social Science Research Council, and the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. A lot done here, a lot accomplished here, Jorge. So welcome again, and looking forward to this conversation today.
Thank you.
So let's start with the concept of the book, which of course is the foundation of the book and is the fundamental theme, which is the concept of active non-alignment. Can you share with us how the concept was formulated and what it means?
Sure. Well, let me put this in perspective. And again, this is my first event at the Quincy Institute, so I would like to express my appreciation for the invitation to join as a non-resident fellow and for the Quincy Institute to be my home away from home, as it were. So, how did the concept of active non-alignment arise? It arose in 2019, 2020, when Latin America was hit by a triple whammy: the pandemic, the ensuing recession, which led to the biggest economic downturn in Latin America in 120 years, and then by the policies of the Trump administration and also by China, they were trying to push Latin America in different directions. So the region was in very bad straits. And with my colleagues, Carlos Fortin and Carlos Ominami, we concluded that we needed a handle. We needed a guide to action, how to handle this very difficult situation. And that is how we coined the term active non-alignment, which takes a page from the traditions of the non-aligned movement in the 50s and 60s, but also adapts it to the realities of the new century. And in that regard, what is very important to understand is that there are very different dynamics at play today than there were, 70 years ago. And in that sense, the rise of the Global South is, of course, a key factor at play. And what we say is that the countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have moved what was known as the diplomatie de cahiers de doléances of the 60s and 70s, which translated into the demands for a new international economic order, the need for transfers of massive resources from the north to the south to compensate for the exploitation that had taken place, to a very different situation today, in which something like half of all of the global trade takes place within the South, in South-South relations. Something similar can be said about FDI flows, which were 20% in the 70s and 80s, and now again above 50% in South-South relations. So it's a very difficult situation, a very different situation, and that is expressed by the notion of collective financial statecraft, which has led to new entities like the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, like the New Development Bank, like the Latin American Development Bank, that shows the financial strength and wherewithal of the South. So it's a very different environment that puts the countries in the Global South in also a very different situation. Active non-alignment just postulates that countries in the Global South need to put their own interests front and center. They need not align themselves with either Washington or Beijing, and they have room for maneuver to do that. Why? Because there is this competition. There is no longer a monopoly in world power. There is you could argue, a duopoly between the United States and China. And that means you have a margin for maneuver. You can play one of the great powers against the other. And that is what we argue is active and non-alignment all about.
Yes, indeed. And you mentioned the Global South as a very important category. And in your book, you discuss the debates around it and make a case how the term is not as often misperceived and then criticized as something related to directionality. It is related to geopolitics. And in fact, I myself wrote an article a couple of years ago in Foreign Affairs where I called it a geopolitical fact. I think there's a real need to sort of talk about the Global South as a thing and not just as imaginary. Can you elaborate on your arguments, which I think you spent quite some time on in the book, on how you conceive of the Global South and its importance?
Yes, absolutely. Here again, what is very important to understand is the shift that we have had from the old notion of third world, which was the dominant concept about these countries in, again, the 70s and 80s, to the newer term, Global South. The third world, of course, came up as a notion for these countries that were not part of the so-called first world, the capitalist developed countries of the North Atlantic, nor the second world, the socialist countries around in Moscow's orbit, but countries that were in a different position. Now, that term, which reflected the time in the second half of the 20th century, also ended up having a bit of a negative connotation, meaning, tin pot dictators, great economic weakness, many social difficulties. And the term Global South, once the second world, the socialist world in Eastern and Central Europe ceased to exist, you couldn't very well talk about a third world. That's how the notion of Global South came to be much more dominant. Now, what is interesting here, of course, it's not an uncontested term. There are some people that question its very existence, and they say there is no such thing. It's just a bunch of countries, which, as a social scientist, I find difficult to fathom. There are obviously differences between these countries. They do not, convey a unanimous position. But what they feel is that they have been excluded. These are countries that have not had a place at the high table of world politics. Some of them are richer than others. Some of them face more difficulties than others. But what they share is that they have been excluded from the high table of world politics, and they would like to place at it. I mean, the best example of that, of course, is the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. There are 2 Western European nations. There are none from Latin America or from Africa, which obviously reflects the realities, I suppose you could say, of 1945. But it certainly doesn't reflect the realities of 2025. One last thing. Some people argue and say, well, India and China are part of the Northern Hemisphere. How can you put them into the global south? Well, this is not geography 101. As you said, it's a geopolitical concept.
Indeed, indeed. And your point is very pertinent that what we defined as a structure of the world order in 1945 is still with us after 80 years and moves to reform the UNSC are going extremely slowly. That certainly is more than overdue for change.
That's right, absolutely.
The point very well taken. Your opening chapters of the book, you start with the war in Ukraine, and of course, there's also terrible war raging in Gaza, and that's extended in its dimensions to the rest of the Middle East. We recently had an attack on Qatar, and the Ukraine war also continues. And in your book, you talk about how in the case of the Ukraine war, for example, the UN votes were in favor of the West's condemnation of what's clearly an illegal invasion by Russia. On the other hand, practically no country in the global south, save one or two, joined the attempted global sanctions regime that was initiated by the United States and the West. Uh, and then when you turn to Gaza, the gap between the US or Europe and the global south seems even wider, if anything. So what is the West missing here? What has caused this massive gap, and how can the West actually find a way to bring the global South in a place where it can work with on these issues?
Sure. Well, what is so interesting is that our project developing this notion, which is now taking some 5 years, is fascinating to watch how it has evolved, because our original project led to an edited volume in Spanish that was published in 2021, in November of 2021, with chapters by 6 former Latin American foreign ministers. So, it had a lot of, force and representativity. And some people argued that this was fine, the book was well received, and so on. We had launches in about 5, 6 countries. But they say, well, this is à la recherche temps perdu. Non-alignment has little to do with the realities of the 21st century, the age of AI, of the digital economy, and so on. This is quite passé. Well, 3 months after we launched that book in Spanish on active non-alignment for Latin America, the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place. And suddenly, non-alignment was back with a vengeance. Why? Because many countries, India, South Africa, Brazil, others, took essentially non-aligned positions. They refused to stand with the United States, with the West, on the issue of the war. And not because they necessarily condoned the invasion of Ukraine. Many of them condemned it. But what they said, what we cannot stand for, is to make this a unique war, that the whole world should stand against Russia. There have been many wars in the world, there are still many wars in the world, to make Russia into the object of this sort of worldwide embargo is not something we want to stand with. And so that gave an enormous push to the positions of the Global South. And then, of course, something similar happened with Gaza, in which the gap between the humanitarian concerns expressed by the West on what was happening in Ukraine contrasted with the generalized indifference to the humanitarian suffering taking place in Gaza. Not only was there indifference to it, in fact, countries like the United States and Germany provided the weapons with which Israel attacked Gaza and led to some 60,000 deaths, 20,000 children killed in this. And again, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the contrast between the perspectives on the West on humanitarian suffering in Ukraine and in Gaza couldn't be greater. Why? Well, Ukraine is in Europe, and therefore, somehow, there's the perception that for the West, the notion of universal human rights isn't really universal. It applies only to Europeans and people that look like them. If it comes to people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, that concern disappears. And that is, again, something that is given great force and great strength to the notion of active non-alignment.
Indeed, related to this sort of implicit framing of Eurocentrism, if you will, or West-centrism, is also this argument on democracy versus autocracy. We saw a lot of that in the Biden administration. We thought that in the Trump administration that would go away. But actually, just last week, we had Peter Navarro, a major trade advisor to the government, speak of democracy as being a fundamental reason why India should side with the U.S. on the Ukraine war. So the rhetoric may have reduced, but is still there in Washington. Certainly, you see it among the think tank circuit and so forth. So how in your book you talk about this as a part of a values question that's always framed, and the Global South has asked why are you not with the right values, so to speak. What is a counter to that, if any?
Yes, no, I think that's a great point. And obviously, in the case of Latin America in particular, the argument is often made that Latin America shares so much. Say, let us take Europe for a moment, with Europe, its institutions, its values, its traditions. And of course, a country like Argentina shares a lot more with, say, France or Germany, let alone Spain, than it does with, China or India. There's no doubt about it. But if one starts to unpack the argument a bit more, one realizes that issues are a bit more complex than that. Let me give you an example. What happened with the pandemic, which for Latin America, with 8% of the world's population, had something like 28% of the world's fatalities from the pandemic, according to official figures. So it was inordinately hit, and it was a very difficult and tragic moment. Now, what is very interesting to realize is that at that moment, in the first half of 2021, when the vaccines for COVID were available in Europe and in the United States, Latin American countries tried to buy them, and they were told in no uncertain terms they would not be available to them. For those first 6 months that were so critical, both Europe and the United States refused to provide anti-COVID vaccines to countries in Latin America. Which countries did provide them? China, Russia, India. So the question then becomes, you say, well, it's a question of shared values. Well, when at a moment of crisis, of great national emergency, those shared values do not translate into concrete actions that help the countries with which you are supposed to share those values, in this case, Latin America. And those countries with whom you according to this reasoning, you do not share those values, do come through and provide those vaccines. Well, the argument becomes a bit empty, it seems to me. So I look at this argument of values with great skepticism. In 8 years, from 2015 to 2023, when Latin America went through some of the most difficult moments in a century, Europe totally ignored it. There was no Europe-Latin America summit in those 8 years, although they're supposed to be held every 3 years. And the US met with Latin America in the Summit of the Americas. China met with Latin America in the Ministerial Forum. Europe totally ignored the region. And then in 2023, suddenly Europe said, well, let us meet. Let us have a Europe-Latin America summit in Brussels. Well, and the purpose of that was not to help Latin America. The purpose of that was showcase the war in Ukraine. And in fact, the keynote speaker that was invited originally was President Zelensky, who had to be disinvited because Latin American leaders had no interest in participating in such an exercise. So again, the question of values in abstract terms sounds quite attractive. In practice, it means something else. And active non-alignment is a realist approach to international relations. We look at things as they are, rather than like we would like them to look like. And in that sense, it provides, it seems to us, a much better guide to action, a compass to navigate these very troubled waters in which we find ourselves.
Yes, indeed, you mentioned practice, and I am also a firm believer that one should watch practice more than words and rhetoric. Rhetoric has value, is important, speech has effects, but ultimately, when you don't have material actions that are in tune with it, then the world can tell and it
Yes,
notices. And of course, as
yes.
the
And
example
let
you
me add,
gave, yeah,
yes. Let me
yeah,
add something else to that. The
please.
argument is often made that the countries in Latin America, let's stick to Latin America for a while, should not engage with so-called extra-regional powers. The countries like Russia, like China, like Iran, some even bring in India and this, have nothing really to do in the Western Hemisphere. And that, in fact, they should stay away. Well, that is an argument, it seems to me, that first of all, bears little relation to the realities of a globalized, interdependent world. Why should countries in Latin America not engage with countries in Africa, Asia, and Europe? I mean, it doesn't make much sense. The fastest growing region in the world today is in East Asia. Should Latin America ignore that? At its core is China. Should you ignore that and sacrifice your own development for this, very dubious argument? That's number one. Number two, as the case of the pandemic that I just mentioned illustrates, it is very useful to diversify your foreign links, to have more rather than fewer of those links, because they will allow you to come out of emergencies on top rather than, be limited in your options and your alternatives.
Yes, absolutely. By the way, for all our viewers, please drop your questions onto the chat. We are getting some already, but please keep dropping them so that we can get to more of them. We have a question from Antonio Meloni, who brings up the question of Brazil. What are the benefits of Brazil to engage with Russia and China? But really, this also goes to one of the things you yourself have said, Jorge, that is example of President Lula of Brazil, who is in many ways practicing active non-alignment and is implementing a set of policies that are in tune with it. So can you tell us more about how President Lula, just as an example, there are others, but as an
Sure.
example, how he is conducting his policies in a way that are
Sure.
consistent?
Yeah, no, Brazil, it seems to me, is a very interesting example of active non-alignment in practice. Brazil is today, under the leadership of President Lula, very much at the heart of diplomatic activity around the world. Last year, it hosted the G20. This year, it hosted the BRICS. And at the end of this year, it will be hosting the COP30 summit. So, I mean, obviously, it is very much, exercising a significant leadership role. Now, what is important here to understand, I will say two things. In the case of the BRICS, there are different views within the BRICS how the BRICS should go. And so China and Russia would like to make the BRICS into basically an anti-Western platform, as a counter, say, to the G7. Brazil, Russia, and India, among the founding members, are in a different position. They would like to make the BRICS into, a non-aligned platform, one that stands aside from this conflict between China and the United States. And here, just a footnote, I would argue that China and Russia are not really part of the global South. Russia, obviously not. And China has traditionally stand aside from the non-aligned movement, and it is also in contention with the US. So, on the BRICS, the argument that I make, it is not a platform of the global South because of China and Russia, but it is a platform for the global South that has taken positions in favor of the demands of the global South in a way that, say, the G7 or other entities have not. Now, in that case and in others, Brazil plays a very significant role. One of the most important features of Brazilian foreign policy has traditionally been its ability to build coalitions. It was part of, it triggered IPSA, the India-Brazil-South Africa initiative, of course, the BRICS, and, in other cases in South America plays an important role. And in the more recent past, of course, we have had Brazil's reaction to the tariffs, that 50% tariffs that have been imposed by the United States on it. And Brazil has stood its ground. It is not given in. And that is exactly, it seems to me, what active non-alignment is all about.
Let's turn to the Western Hemisphere.
Mm.
And, the advent of the Trump administration, we have seen a declaration of special interest in the Western Hemisphere, which really means Latin America for the most part, because except
Sure,
for Canada.
sure.
And that's a good thing in some ways, one would hope, because for a long period after the Cold War, the United States sort of seemed to have lost interest in Latin America,
Mhm.
moved on to the Middle East, to Asia. And so the return of Latin America as an area of interest in the US can bring some productive solutions, productive policies, and so forth. But we are also seeing a focus on crime, on drug cartels, on immigration. We've just had a attack in the Caribbean on a boat
Sure,
that was said to be, you know, uh, part of the drug cartels. Some
sure.
people died. Many have argued that we are actually seeing a re-Monroeization of Latin America. The old
Mhm.
Monroe Doctrine is coming back in a new
Right,
guise.
right.
Now, of course, we know there's a long history, and you know this better than almost anybody. Long history of U.S. interventionism in Latin America goes back to Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, and then all the Cold War years as well. So look into your crystal ball for a minute and tell us, how do you see this particular focus or refocus evolving? Is it going to be like the old days? How is the Latin American region going to respond to the new policies?
Sure. Well, two things. First, it's important to understand that the world of 2025 is very different from the world of 1823, when the Monroe Doctrine was announced, in the sense, as I said earlier, that we live today in a globalized, interdependent world. And therefore, this means that Latin America has much more diversified ties, diplomatic, financial, trade ties than it did in the past. I mean, to give you only an example, for South America as a whole, uh, which represents 80% of the region's population, China is the number one trading partner. So that is something that is there. It's not going away. And invoking the Monroe Doctrine certainly won't do it. Now, two, I agree with you that, obviously, in some ways, it is a good thing that Washington focuses on the region. Secretary of State Rubio's visit to Panama in February was the first time since 1911 that the first visit abroad by a US Secretary of State was to Latin America. So you could argue, well, that it's a positive thing. The region has many challenges, and the United States can obviously play a role in overcoming them. Now, the problem is, you could argue, that there was something called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially, attributed the United States a right to intervene in countries in the region that did not pay their debts or that otherwise did the things that the United States did not agree with. Well, you could argue that now we're having a bit of a sort of Trump amendment to the Roosevelt corollary. But the problem with it is that it's all sticks and no carrots. What you mentioned on the case of migration, on the case of drugs, on the case of organized crime, it's all sticks, and there are no carrots. The United States isn't offering anything helpful to overcome the significant development challenges and the significant social challenges that Latin America, which is the most unequal region in the world in terms of income distribution, can face. Latin America has a very serious problem. There was a recent report by a group called the Group of 30, which asked, why does Latin America underperform? Latin America is in some ways the slowest growing region in the world. And things are really bad. The region still hasn't come out of the post-pandemic crisis. And the United States isn't offering much to overcome them. So if diplomacy is the art of making friends abroad, as Otto von Bismarck famously said, all sticks and no carrots is not the way to make friends. So I am skeptical about the success of this policy.
Right, indeed. We have a question from Hanan Abdul, who talks about the tariff policies of the
Mhm.
United States. And I'm going to tie it to a broader theme, which is that of globalization.
Mhm.
You speak in your book of how the Washington consensus, that of extreme state withdrawal from the market and imposition of conditionalities by the IMF and the World Bank and so forth, did not lead to positive outcomes in the
Mhm.
global south, in Latin America. But then now we are seeing a turn in the United States to the other extreme, where trade itself is seen as a threat, tariffs all round are seen as a solution.
So,
And if not directly or explicitly said, autarky, at least direction in the travel of autarky, is seen as a very desirable thing in and of
mhm.
itself. The argument is this will help industrialization, it will help worker rights and working class wages and so forth. So I see a spectrum. At one end, we had the Washington consensus of the 90s and the noughties.
Mhm.
The other end, we have this new hostility to trade that is emerging from the US and potentially parts of Europe. But yet, in the rest of the world, certainly in the global south, we are seeing a continuing embrace of trade deals. We saw the Mercosur EU deal signed.
Mhm.
We have seen the Indonesia Peru free trade deal signed. We have seen India and the UK signing a deal. What does all this signify, and where do you personally stand between, say, the spectrum between the Washington consensus at one end and this sort of rebellion against trade period or suspicion of trade period that seems to be happening here in the US?
Sure. Well, I will say this. What we have had, I would argue since 1980, which according to some measures was the year when the current wave of globalization started, with the invention coming on the market of the personal computer and with CNN coming on stream. Over the past, the 40 years or so, globalization has really come into its own. But what we have seen, basically, I would argue since 2015, 2016, there has been a backlash against globalization in the North, in the United States, in Britain. You had Brexit, of course, the election of Mr. Trump in 2016 and his re-election in last year. Because basically the view in these countries in the North was that globalization had essentially backfired, that it didn't bring the progress that they expected. And obviously, countries like China, like India, my own country, Chile, have benefited considerably from globalization. I mean, you look at the global figures, the way this period has helped people come up from poverty, raise incomes, and bring so much progress. You could very well argue that in global terms, globalization has been very beneficial for many people around the world. In my own country, Chile, which is a country that has signed the largest number of free trade agreements of any country, we have signed something like 30 free trade agreements with 65 countries around the world. And Chile has benefited mightily from it. Chile is one of only 6 countries in the world that has free trade agreements both with China and with the United States. There are not many that do that. So my view is that free trade has been a very beneficial thing for many countries around the world, that this reaction against free trade in the North, not just in the United States, also some other countries, ultimately is very short-sighted. And what we are seeing is basically, a trade diversion. Countries in Latin America, in Africa, the way China-Africa trade has increased in the past year or so is extraordinary, pushed among other things by these trade barriers, by these tariffs that have been erected by the Trump administration. So my sense is that countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America want more free trade. And what they will do is they will interact more with each other and with countries in the North that still believe in free trade. My own sense is that ultimately this will be the United States' loss.
That seems to be the case to me as well. I mean, the fact that the curious thing really, Jorge, and you know this very well, the whole theory of dependencia that came from Latin America, where Raul
Mm,
Prebisch was
mm,
tried out in the global south, was tried in India, it was tried in Asia and
mm.
Africa, and it basically didn't work.
Of course,
And
absolutely.
and what we had is a course correction in the global south, which is
Mm,
much more pragmatic.
mm,
And now it seems that the United States may be making the same mistake. And it's funny to see that coming from a wealthy country because the arguments from the global south countries were always that they were weaker. And so they
mm,
had to protect themselves against these very powerful and wealthy
mm,
northern countries.
mm.
But now the global
Absolutely.
south, trading with the global south, trading with China is seen as a threat to the
Mm.
wealthy United States, which is very interesting as an observation to me.
Yeah.
So
Well, one of the great ironies, you might say, is that the biggest champion of free trade in the world today is the Communist Party of China. I mean, it's I find it very ironic, I must say. My own experience as ambassador to China allowed me to see firsthand how that works. Under my watch, Chile upgraded its free trade agreement. Chile was a country that signed the first free trade agreement with an individual country that China signed in 2005 was with Chile. And in 2017, it was upgraded to include services and other disciplines. And I also had the chance to uh, negotiate an agreement to avoid double taxation. So Chile signed an agreement to avoid double taxation with China before it did with the United States. There is some irony in there. Again, the point is, and this goes back to my earlier argument, the difference that exists today in the competition between China and the United States and the one that existed during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. There are some comparable elements. There is great power competition, and these are China and the Soviet Union are countries that define themselves as communist states, and they compete with the United States on a variety of fronts. But a key difference is that the Soviet Union was a much smaller economy, was also a closed economy. Therefore, although it competed with the United States in military matters, in space, in nuclear development, and so on, it really couldn't compete economically. It couldn't provide the trade flows, the investment flows, financial flows that China can. China is, according to PPP terms, a bigger economy than the US today. And it is, in some ways, a more open economy than the US. Therefore, there is the possibility for countries in the global south to compete, what we call to play the field. You want to build a port. Well, will the US offer the best conditions or will China do so? You want to build a railway. You want to build, a highway. Which companies will provide the best conditions? Will they be US companies or Chinese companies? So there is competition there. And that is what active non-alignment can take advantage of.
there's a question from Rashad King who wants to understand whether the history of colonialism is a factor.
Mhm.
Now, certainly we know that in the 50s and 60s, Bandung, that was a big issue because these
Um,
countries had just come out of it, and some of them were not
Sure,
actually free. In Africa, most
sure,
were not. And that
sure,
was very much in the living memory. But today
sure.
we are, with the exception of a few countries, we are quite far from that era.
Mhm.
Can we say that the colonial effect, of course, materially exists, but in terms of the minds of the global South leaders,
Mhm.
has mostly disappeared? Is it
Mhm.
still there? Is it just less intense? What's your take?
Well, I will say this. Obviously, the impact of colonialism is much more recent in some countries. It is much more recent, say, in most of Africa and certain Asian countries in the Caribbean. It is obviously less so in Latin America, which became independent 2 centuries ago. So there are different impacts. But I would say this. The key point here to understand is that the non-aligned movement was inspired by very lofty ideals that had to do with this new sovereignty, the need to safeguard the independence of these, newly independent countries. Active non-alignment, on the other hand, is a much more pragmatic view of the world. It takes the world as it is, and it is concerned with development. It is concerned about improving the standard of living of people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I mean, the problems have not gone away. I was just looking at some numbers. In 2024, developing countries paid $50 billion more in servicing their debt than they got in loans from various entities around the world. So there's a real problem. Many countries in the third world, what was known as the third world, today the global south, are facing serious financial difficulties. So the problems are very much there. But at the same time, we have, these newly rising powers like China, like India. There are entities like the AIIB, like the New Development Bank, like the Latin American Development Bank, that can offer alternatives, that can offer new possibilities for these countries to come out of their challenges and of their difficulties.
There is the example in your own home country of Chile. You provide some examples in your book. One of them is the Chilean, uh, the presence of vast lithium reserves in Chile, and the fact that Chile is playing it very smartly, playing the field,
That's right.
not adopting an extreme free market approach, but yet is very much working with the private sector, energizing the private sector, welcoming the private sector. So how is it finding that balance with foreign investors, its own interests in this very important resource for the future?
Yes, absolutely. No, Chile has been through a somewhat rocky period in the past few years, as we all know, but it has very significant assets. I would argue that Chile has three very important assets that allow it to weather these difficulties and will continue to make it what is basically the most developed country in Latin America. First of all, is its institutional traditions that allow it to, keep the boat going, as it were, despite the bad weather. Two, it has, of course, copper. Chile is the country with the biggest copper reserves in the world, something like 22% of the world's proven copper reserves are in Chile. It's also the major producer and export of copper. And three, it is part, of course, of the so-called lithium triangle that includes Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina, with some of the biggest reserves. Now, you're quite right. Chile has played its cards well. For example, in the case of copper, the high price of copper is over $4 a pound now. The cost is around $2. So there's a significant margin there for copper producers. Chile has Codelco, which is one of the biggest copper companies in the world. It's a state-owned company. Now, this means that the profits from this company go to, the Chilean government and allows it to do things that it otherwise wouldn't be able to do. That's number one. In the case of lithium, Chile has been very careful in husbanding these resources, and there are both US companies and Chinese companies in Chile, Tianqi Lithium from China, also US companies. And Chile is trying to find a way, this also holds for copper, that more value is added in Chile, as opposed to just exporting it in raw form. Now, that's an ongoing challenge. In an ideal world, Chile would like to, say, make lithium batteries in Chile. Now, we are far away from the main markets for these batteries, so it's a bit of a challenge. But that's where we're at, and the government is looking at it in various ways.
One interesting experiment or other institution in your own region is Mercosur, and Mercosur has had its ups and downs. But now with this agreement with Europe, there seems to be a new wind to Mercosur. There's also this outreach, as you pointed out, to China and Asia. In fact, you give an example of Ecuador in your book, where Ecuador could not sign a free trade agreement with the US because the US said we are not into trade agreements. It
No,
goes to China. China says, welcome, let's do it,
that's
and does it.
that's right.
So
Absolutely.
actually, I have two questions in this regard. The first one is the future of Mercosur. Do you see Mercosur emerging in this third or fourth wind as a cohesive bloc that can help the region grow? And second, from your own experience as ambassador, you
Mhm.
were instrumental in negotiating that free trade agreement between Chile and China.
Mhm.
What was your experience of the Chinese negotiating style?
Mhm. Sure. Well, on the issue of Mercosur, um, the fact that Mercosur came into place marked a real turning point in South American history. Why? Because it brought together the two South American giants, Brazil and Argentina, that had been rivals for quite some time. And when Mercosur was launched in 1991, that was a very important turning point. Now, for the first 5, 6 years, trade increased exponentially, and the automotive industries of Brazil and Argentina were integrated quite quickly, and to this day, they work together very closely. Now, you could argue that Mercosur has not fulfilled its early promise, and I would argue that there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that it hasn't been as institutionalized as it should. Brazil role is so important. The Brazilian economy is so big, and the weight of Brazil within Mercosur is such that it creates a bit of an imbalanced structure. And Brazil, has basically not been as willing as it should to create the, dispute resolution mechanisms and institutionalize it in a way that would make it work better, rather than simply deciding things at, the presidential level, which is what has happened. And at various stages, Uruguay and Argentina have been sort of unhappy with the tariffs of Mercosur and how strict it is in blocking deals with other countries. Uruguay, for example, has been keen to sign a free trade agreement with the US for quite some time, but it can't because it is part of Mercosur, and President Milei of Argentina is also quite unhappy with Mercosur and would like to get out but can't. So there have been these ups and downs. I would hope that perhaps this deal with the European Union might signal a new phase and lead Mercosur to fulfill its potential. Now, in the case of Chile and China, I was not directly involved in the first FTA. The FTA that was signed was in 2005. I was ambassador in India at the time. I wasn't in China. But I will tell you a little story about it that you would enjoy, and it shows the dynamic at play. Chile was very keen to get wine into the list of the FTA, and the Chinese negotiator. This was told to me, the Chilean negotiator. Chinese negotiator was very reluctant, and they went back and forth. So at one point, the Chinese negotiator said, "Well, I will tell you the real reason we don't want Chilean wine on the list of the FTA. Your wine is so good, and we are so many, that we would drink it all up, and we will leave you without any wine, Chilean wine for yourselves." So the Chilean negotiator says, "Well, if that were to be the case, we would be ready to make the ultimate sacrifice." And the Chinese negotiator was puzzled and said, "What do you mean by the ultimate sacrifice?" And he said, "We would drink Argentine wine." So what I had the chance to do and observe close at was the negotiation of the upgrading of that free trade agreement in 2017, and which include, as I said, services and competition policy and other disciplines. So that was the first, FTA with China that was upgraded, and that was a very positive experience. Chile today exports 40% of its exports go to China, and Chile runs a trade surplus with China, with not many countries do. Trade between Chile and China was around $8 billion in 2005. Today, it approaches nearly $60 billion. So if anybody can be witness to the fact of how positive these free trade agreements can be, it is certainly Chile.
No question. I think this is a point that needs to be made, especially now in Washington,
Mhm.
where everybody has concluded that globalization was a disaster for the world. Somehow it's extrapolated to the world when This is really a conversation within the United States. And in many countries you travel to in Asia, even
Mhm.
Africa has its own regional free trade agreement now, and they're implementing it with gusto. My latest conversations, there are obviously challenges, but you're seeing more African leaders looking toward the continent for new ties, new integration approaches than the traditional, 20 years ago, it was all about Europe and the United States.
Absolutely.
So countries across the global south are realizing that perhaps even if the West withdraws from this paradigm, they're not going to do that.
Mhm.
And I think in many ways they're going to be proven right. At least many of them will.
Mhm.
I have a question from which is kind of a interesting and intriguing one that may apply to the whole global south, but certainly applies to Latin America, which is this is from Mark Imbellissieri, who
Mhm.
wants to know the left divide in Latin America. You seem, obviously there is one. We have one here in the US.
Well,
And the right in Latin America, at least parts of it, seem to be much closer to the United States than the left. Is this a dynamic in the way the region is going to look at engaging with the world? Does it paralyze the region's policies? Is it more a second order factor? Ultimately, the interests of the countries will prevail over these internal divisions.
sure. No, there is no doubt that there has been a rise of the far right in Latin America. We saw that in Brazil. We've seen that in Argentina. The right has also been on the rise in Chile. We have elections in November. So that is an issue. There's no doubt about it. Now, obviously, governments on the far right have different views of the world than those in the center and on the left. But I will say this. With my colleagues, Fortino Nominami, we believe very strongly that active non-alignment is not a policy of leftist or centrist governments alone. It is a pragmatic approach that can be used by governments of different political ideologies. You mentioned the case of Ecuador. The free trade agreement with China was negotiated by a conservative government. So active non-alignment is not an ideological position. It is a guide to action. That's number one. The second point I would like to make is that we have some, particularly on the issue of China, we have some experience now on how right-wing governments deal with China. In the case of Brazil, under President Bolsonaro, Mr. Bolsonaro ran a campaign in 2018, basically on an anti-China platform. One of his rallying cries at his demonstrations was China is not buying Brazilian companies. China is buying Brazil. And he would get a big round of applause after that. And one of the things he was keen on doing was to leave the BRICS group, which he saw as an anti-American group. And when he proposed to do this in his first month in office, he was told in no uncertain terms that he was not going to do that. Both the military and business told him, we don't want that. Brazil has a place at the table of world leaders, and you are not going to give this up. And in fact, Mr. Bolsonaro later that year in 2019 hosted President Xi and hosted the BRICS summit. So that's the number one example. Number two, of course, is the case of President Milei in Argentina. He also ran on an anti-China platform, saying that his government would have nothing to do with China in authoritarian and totalitarian regime which he despised. Well, a little later, once in office, The Economist published a cover story interview with him in which he sang the praises of China and of President Xi and how keen he was to visit China. Why? Well, there's a reason for that. Argentina has a huge foreign debt. China can provide and does provide loans to allow Argentina to pay that debt. And Mr. Milei knows a good thing when he sees one. So in both of those cases, whatever their worldview is, Argentina and Brazil realize that the structure of the world economy is such that they cannot afford to simply, dismiss China or pretend China isn't there. They have to engage it. And that is what we argue also in our book. It's not a question of ideological preferences. This is what the structure of the international political economy basically, pushes you to do.
Indeed. We are almost out of time. We are close to the end of the top of the hour, and it's been a fantastic conversation, Jorge, about your
Thank
book,
you.
about this very dynamic question of the global south in the world. Even as the world is changing before our eyes, every month we are seeing changes practically, and we're going to see a lot more. But thank you for joining us today and
No,
sharing these
thank
thoughts
you.
from your new book. And we will continue this conversation in other formats, I'm sure.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
and to our viewers, thank you for participating. We have many events, many webinars, many publications. They're all on our website, quincyinst.org. Take a look, sign up, participate, join, and let us continue the conversation and take it forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.